In the vast emptiness of space, where alien empires rise and fall like waves against cosmic shores, there exists a truth that even the most advanced civilizations struggle to understand. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't technology, plasma cannons, or quantum shields. Sometimes it's something far more primitive, far more human, the willingness of one person to stand between evil and innocence, no matter the cost. On a forgotten frontier world called New Tombstone, where the ghosts of Earth's Old West dance with the shadows of humanity's darkest hour, a story unfolds that will shake the foundations of a galaxy that thought it knew what humans were capable of. Here, in a place where hope goes to die, two souls will discover that love doesn't need words, courage doesn't need an army, and sometimes the smallest acts of defiance can topple the mightiest of empires. This is not just a story of survival. This is a testament to the indomitable spirit that flows through human veins, a spirit that refuses to yield, refuses to break, and refuses to let evil win, even when the odds are insurmountable and the enemy seems unstoppable. Welcome to the last stand of Jake Iron Horse Morrison, the cowboy who chose love over fear, and Zara 7, the alien bride who found her voice when it mattered most. The dust on New Tombstone never settled. It hung in the air like the ghosts of better days, swirling around the worn boots of Jake Morrison as he pushed through the saloon doors of the Cosmic Horseshoe. The hinges creaked with a sound that reminded him of his grandfather's old barn back on Earth, before the expansion wars had turned his home planet into a memory and a handful of radioactive craters. Jake's weathered hands adjusted the plasma revolver on his hip, a hybrid weapon that married Earth technology with alien components he'd scavenged from a dozen different worlds. His hat, genuine leather from a Terran cow that had died 3 centuries ago, cast shadows across his face as he surveyed the nearly empty saloon. The establishment had seen better days, much like everything else on this forgotten frontier world at the edge of human space. Behind the bar stood Molly O'Reilly, her red hair streaked with premature gray and her Irish accent still thick after 40 years among the stars. She'd been running the Cosmic Horseshoe since before the Zephyrian Confederacy had declared humans a minor species and relegated them to the Outer Rim worlds. Her establishment served as sanctuary, trading post, and courthouse all rolled into one for the desperate souls who ended up on New Tombstone. "Jake Morrison," Molly called out, not looking up from the glass she was cleaning with mechanical precision. "Heard you were dead." "Been hearing that for 15 years, Molly," Jake replied, his voice carrying the gravel of a man who'd seen too much and said too little. "Still breathing, still writing. Still fighting a war that ended a decade ago?" Jake's jaw tightened. The resistance might have officially surrendered, might have signed the papers that made humans second-class citizens in their own galaxy, but Jake had never gotten the memo. Or maybe he had, and he'd just chosen to use it for kindling. "Some wars don't end just because politicians sign papers," he said, settling onto a barstool that had probably been salvaged from a crashed Earthship. "They end when the last man standing decides they're over." Molly finally looked up, her green eyes holding the kind of sadness that came from watching too many good people die for causes that history would forget. "And you figure you're that last man?" "I'm the only man fool enough to keep trying." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching engines, not the smooth hum of Confederacy hover vehicles, but the harsh roar of combustion engines that spoke of desperation and jury-rigged repairs. Jake's hand instinctively moved toward his weapon as 3 vehicles skidded to a stop outside the saloon, kicking up clouds of rust-colored dust. The doors burst open, and Commander Vextar of the Zephyrian Confederacy strode in with the kind of arrogance that could only come from a species that had never learned the meaning of defeat. His scaled hide gleamed with an oily sheen under the saloon's dim lights, and his forearms moved with predatory grace as his reptilian eyes scanned the room. Behind him came a squad of Zephyrian soldiers, their energy weapons powered and ready. They moved like a pack of hunters who'd cornered their prey, confident and cruel in equal measure. But it wasn't the soldiers that made Jake's blood run cold, it was what they were dragging between them. She couldn't have been more than 25 in human years, though with her species it was hard to tell. Her skin had a faint blue tint that marked her as Altarian, and her silver hair fell in waves around a face that would have been beautiful if not for the fear that haunted her violet eyes. She wore what had once been an elegant gown, now torn and dirty from whatever ordeal had brought her here. Her hands were bound with neural restraints that would send jolts of pain through her nervous system if she tried to speak or resist. "Barkeeper," Vextar hissed, his forked tongue tasting the air. "We require sustenance and lodging for the night. We are transporting this cargo to the slave markets on Zirian Prime." Molly's face went white, but she nodded slowly.
This is a neutral establishment, Commander.
We serve all species, but we don't ask questions about business.
Wise policy. Vexstar's laugh sounded like breaking glass.
Though I suspect your establishment's neutrality depends greatly on who's paying. Jake felt something cold and hard settle in his gut as he watched the alien woman, the bride, he realized, noting the ceremonial markings still visible on her torn gown. Someone had married her, probably in some political alliance, and now she was being sold like livestock. It was a common enough practice in Confederate space, where humans and other minor species existed at the whim of their reptilian overlords. The girl's eyes found his across the room, and, in that moment, Jake saw something that made his decision for him. It wasn't just fear in those violet depths, it was defiance. Broken, beaten down, but still burning. She reminded him of his sister Sarah, who'd died defending Earth's last city while Jake was off playing soldier in some meaningless skirmish 3 sectors away. Your cargo looks thirsty, Jake said casually, not turning around on his bar stool. Might want to give her some water before she collapses. The saloon went dead quiet. Even the ancient ventilation system seemed to hold its breath. Vexstar's head swiveled toward Jake with the fluid motion of a snake preparing to strike. I do not recall asking for your opinion, human. Didn't realize you needed permission to give it. Jake finally turned, his hand resting casually near his weapon. Just seems like poor business practice to let your merchandise die of dehydration. My merchandise is none of your concern. Everything that happens in this saloon is my concern. The lie came easily. Jake Morrison had no official authority anywhere in the galaxy, but something in his voice made the Zephyrian soldiers shift nervously. Vexstar studied him with the cold calculation of a predator sizing up potential prey. You speak with considerable confidence for a member of a conquered species. Conquered is a strong word. I prefer temporarily inconvenienced. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Jake could feel Molly's fear radiating from behind the bar, could sense the soldiers' fingers tightening on their weapons. But he also felt something else, a tiny spark of hope from the direction of the bound woman. Perhaps, Vexstar said slowly, you would like to purchase my cargo yourself? I could be persuaded to negotiate a price. Depends on what you're asking. 50,000 Confederate credits. Jake whistled low. 50,000? Must be some special cargo. She is unique. Altarian nobility, trained in the arts of pleasure and diplomacy. Her previous owner had her vocal cords modified, she cannot speak above a whisper, making her the perfect companion for those who prefer their females decorative rather than conversational. The casual cruelty in the alien's voice made Jake's jaw clench, but he kept his expression neutral. 50,000's a lot of credits for a woman who can't hold a conversation. I assure you, conversation is not her primary function. Jake stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. Every eye in the room followed him as he walked over to where the woman knelt between 2 guards. This close, he could see the faint scars on her throat where someone had surgically damaged her voice box. The neuro restraints around her wrists were military grade, designed to cause maximum suffering with minimum permanent damage. What's your name? He asked softly. She looked up at him, those violet eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Her lips moved, but only the faintest whisper emerged. Zara. Zara 7. The number designation told Jake everything he needed to know. She was a clone, probably one of several identical copies created for some noble family's political marriages. Expendable. Replaceable. No one would come looking for her. Well, Zara 7, Jake said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, looks like you're about to change hands again. He reached into his jacket, and half the Zephyrian weapons in the room swiveled toward him. But, instead of a weapon, he pulled out a small device, a credit transfer unit that had seen better days but still functioned. 50,000, he said, holding up the device. Confederate credits, as requested. Vexstar's eyes narrowed. You carry that much currency? On this backwater world? Man in my line of work makes enemies. Enemies sometimes pay good money to make them go away. Jake's smile was cold as winter on Pluto. Lucky for you, I'm between jobs.
The credit transfer took less than 30 seconds.
Vexstar's device chimed softly as the funds appeared in his account, and his demeanor shifted from predatory to merely businesslike. In the Confederate system, everything came down to credits and contracts, and Jake had just made himself a legitimate purchaser rather than a potential problem. The restraints will remain until you leave the planet's atmosphere, Vexstar informed him, producing a small remote control.
Neural feedback will activate if she attempts to flee or resist. Standard precautions. Understood. Then, our business is concluded.
Vexstar gestured to his soldiers, who immediately began filing toward the door.
Enjoy your purchase, human.
May she serve you better than she served her previous masters. Jake waited until the sound of their vehicles had faded into the distance before moving toward Zara 7. She watched him approach with wary eyes, probably expecting him to claim his property in the traditional way. Instead, he knelt down beside her and examined the neural restraints.
These are going to hurt when they come off, he said quietly.
The Zephyrians like their controlled devices to leave an impression.
Her whispered response was barely audible. Why? Why what? Why, help me.
Jake was quiet for a long moment, thinking of Sarah, thinking of all the battles he'd fought and lost, thinking of a galaxy where decency had become a luxury that most people couldn't afford.
Because somebody should, he said finally. And, I happen to be here.
Molly approached with a bottle of something that looked like whiskey but probably wasn't.
Jake, what you just did, buying her doesn't make you her owner under human law, but Confederate law says otherwise. You're technically responsible for her now. Then, I guess I'd better figure out how to be a better master than the last guy. That's not what I mean, and, you know it. Vexstar will be back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but he'll be back.
And, when he comes, he'll bring friends. Jake looked down at Zara 7, who was watching their conversation with the intensity of someone whose life hung on every word.
How long do you figure we have? Maybe a day, maybe a week.
Depends on how long it takes word to spread that Jake Morrison is on New Tombstone, harboring stolen Confederate property.
She's not property. Try telling that to a Zephyrian tribunal. Jake helped Zara 7 to her feet, steadying her when the neural restraints sent a shock through her system for the unauthorized movement.
Her whole body trembled, but she didn't make a sound beyond a sharp intake of breath.
Can you ride? He asked. She nodded. Then, we'd better get moving. This place is about to become very unhealthy for people like us. As they prepared to leave, Molly caught Jake's arm.
There's something you should know about her, she said quietly.
I've seen that gown before, those ceremonial markings. She's not just Altarian nobility, she's from the royal house of Altair Prime.
If she's here, it means their government either sold her off or she's fleeing something worse than slavery. Jake looked back at Zara 7, who was standing by the door like a ghost waiting for permission to haunt the living world.
Worse how? Political marriages on Altair Prime aren't just ceremonies, they're genetic contracts. The bride's DNA gets coded to her husband's biological signature.
If she tries to leave or betray him, the modification kills her.
Slowly. And if her husband dies? Same result.
Unless she finds a way to break the coding within 72 hours of his death.
Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. How long has she been running?
Molly glanced at Zara 7, taking in the exhaustion, the fear, the way she moved like someone who was already dying by inches.
Hard to say. But, if I had to guess?
She's got maybe 48 hours left.
The weight of that knowledge hit Jake like a physical blow.
He'd just bought himself more than a fugitive bride, he'd bought himself a woman with a death sentence hanging over her head, and maybe 48 hours to figure out how to save her life. Outside, the twin suns of New Tombstone were setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded Jake of better days on better worlds. He looked at Zara 7, who stood beside him with the patience of someone who had learned not to expect rescue. Well, he said quietly, I guess we'd better find somewhere safe to make our stand. She looked up at him with those violet eyes, and, for just a moment, Jake thought he saw something that looked almost like hope. It was probably the most dangerous thing either of them could afford to feel. The ancient hoverbike coughed and wheezed as it carried them through the badlands of New Tombstone, its engine held together by spare parts, prayer, and Jake's stubborn refusal to let it die. Zara 7 sat behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist with a grip that spoke of someone who'd learned not to trust the ground beneath her feet. The neural restraints around her wrists glowed softly in the gathering darkness, a constant reminder of the invisible chains that bound her. Jake guided the bike along paths that existed more in memory than reality, following routes he'd mapped during his years as a courier for the Underground Railroad, the network of rebels, smugglers, and decent folks who helped people escape Confederate oppression. Most of those people were dead now, executed when the Zephyrians had finally cracked the organization's encryption codes. But their safe houses remained, hidden in the ruins of humanity's failed colonization efforts. Where are we going? Zara 7's whispered question was almost lost in the wind. Sanctuary, Jake replied, steering around a crater that had once been a farming settlement. Place called Haven. Used to be a mining town before the ore played out. What he didn't tell her was that Haven had been more than just a mining town. It had been the site of the first human victory against Zephyrian forces, back when people still believed they could win. Colonel Marcus Webb had held the town for 6 months with nothing but a battalion of Marines and more courage than sense, turning every building into a fortress and every street into a killing field. The Zephyrians had eventually taken it, but not before Webb and his people had proven that humans could bleed their enemies just as efficiently as anyone else. The town's ruins appeared on the horizon like broken teeth against the star-filled sky. Most of the buildings were collapsed shells, their walls pocked with scorch marks from energy weapons. But Jake knew which structures still had their bones intact, which cellars still held caches of supplies, and which hidden tunnels could turn a last stand into a fighting chance. He guided the bike to a stop outside what had once been the town's saloon, a different saloon than the one where they'd met, but similar enough to feel like a homecoming. The building's facade was mostly intact, though the windows had been blown out years ago and the roof sagged like an old man's shoulders. "This is it," Jake said, helping Zara 7 off the bike. She moved carefully, each step measured to avoid triggering the neural restraints unnecessarily. The devices were programmed to interpret rapid movement as an escape attempt, and Jake had seen what happened to people who pushed their limits too far. Inside, the saloon was a monument to better days. The bar still stood, though half the bottles behind it were empty or shattered. Tables and chairs lay scattered across the floor like the bones of some prehistoric beast, and moonlight streaming through the broken windows painted everything in silver and shadow. But Jake wasn't interested in the main room. He made his way behind the bar, running his hands along the wall until he found the hidden panel that Marcus Webb had installed during his occupation. The mechanism was old but functional, and the wall section slid aside to reveal a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. "Safe room," Jake explained, pulling a thermal lantern from his pack. "Webb built it during the siege. Figured if the Zephyrians overran the town, he'd make them pay for every inch." The underground chamber was larger than it appeared from above, carved into the bedrock with mining equipment and reinforced with salvaged ship plating. Weapon racks lined the walls, though most were empty now. A communication station sat dark and silent in one corner, its encryption keys long since changed. But the medical station was still functional, and that was what Jake needed most. He helped Zara 7 settle onto a medical examination table, noting how she moved with the careful grace of someone who'd learned to live with constant pain. The neural restraints had been designed by a species that understood suffering in ways humans were still learning to comprehend. "I need to examine those restraints," Jake said, pulling a scanner from the medical station's supply cabinet. "Figure out how to get them off without frying your nervous system." Zara 7 held out her hands, watching him with those violet eyes that seemed to see too much. The scanner's readout made Jake curse under his breath. The restraints weren't just simple control devices, they were integrated with her body's neural pathways, designed to cause maximum damage if removed improperly. "Clever bastards," he muttered. "They've got these things wired into your pain receptors and motor functions. Try to cut them off the wrong way, and you'll be paralyzed for life." "Have you done this before?" she whispered. "Something like it. Different species, different restraints, but the principle's the same. Zephyrians love their control mechanisms." Jake pulled up the scanner's technical readouts, studying the device's architecture. "The good news is, these things have a fatal flaw. They're designed to work on Zephyrian physiology first, everything else second.
Your Altarian nervous system is different enough that we might be able to exploit the gaps.
What he didn't tell her was that he'd only attempted this procedure once before, on a Centaurian trader who'd been captured and tortured for information about rebel supply lines. The operation had been successful, but it had taken 3 days and nearly killed both of them in the process.
This is going to hurt, he warned her. A lot. And it's going to take time we don't have. How long?
Jake glanced at the chronometer on his wrist, calculating travel time from the Cosmic Horseshoe to Haven, communication delays to Confederate command, and the typical response time for a Zephyrian military sweep. Vexstar will report our transaction to his superiors within 12 hours. Once they run my biometrics and realize who I am, they'll mobilize a full hunting party.
Figure another 6 hours for them to track us here. 18 hours. Give or take. Could be longer if we're lucky, shorter if we're not. Zara 7 was quiet for a moment, processing the mathematics of survival.
When she spoke again, her voice carried a determination that made Jake look up from his scanner readings.
Tell me about the genetic coding, she said.
The woman at the saloon mentioned it.
How long do I have?
Jake set down the scanner and really looked at her for the first time since they'd arrived. In the soft light of the thermal lantern, he could see details that had been hidden in the saloon's dim illumination. The faint blue tint to her skin was more pronounced around her temples and wrists, following the pattern of her circulatory system. Her silver hair had an almost metallic sheen that suggested some kind of artificial enhancement. But it was her eyes that held his attention, violet depths that seemed to hold the weight of worlds.
Molly said 48 hours, he admitted. But that was based on observation, not medical knowledge. How long since your husband died? 26 hours, 17 minutes.
She said it with the precision of someone who'd been counting every second since her world fell apart.
That gives us maybe 22 hours to break the coding.
Cutting it close, but possible.
What happens if we fail? Jake had never been one to sugarcoat hard truths. The coding attacks your nervous system from the inside out. Starts with paralysis, moves on to organ failure.
From what I've heard, it takes about 6 hours from onset to death.
Not pleasant.
Zara 7 absorbed this information with the stoic acceptance of someone who'd already made peace with dying.
And if we succeed in breaking the coding but fail to remove the restraints? Then, we'll be trapped here when the Zephyrians arrive.
They'll take you back, probably execute me, and we'll both end up as examples of what happens to people who challenge Confederate authority. So we have approximately 18 hours to perform 2 procedures that could each take days under ideal conditions.
That's about the size of it.
Then, we'd better get started. Jake spent the next hour preparing the medical station, calibrating instruments and reviewing procedure manuals that had been written for species he'd never heard of. The underground chamber's medical database was extensive, a legacy of Marcus Webb's paranoid preparation for siege conditions. But most of the information dealt with human physiology, and Jake found himself extrapolating from partial data and educated guesswork. Meanwhile, Zara 7 sat quietly on the examination table, occasionally offering whispered answers to his technical questions. Her knowledge of Altarian biology was extensive, suggesting an education that went beyond the typical training given to political brides. You're not just nobility, Jake observed, noting her precise descriptions of neural pathway configurations.
You're a scientist. Bioengineering, she confirmed. Specialized in cross-species genetic compatibility. Ironic, considering my current situation. That education might save your life. Most of these procedures require real-time feedback from the patient. If you understand what's happening to your body, you can guide me through the dangerous parts. Why are you helping me? The question came suddenly, interrupting his calibration of a neural probe.
You could have left me with the Zephyrians, avoided all this risk. Jake paused in his work, thinking about how to answer a question he wasn't entirely sure he understood himself. You remind me of someone, he said finally.
My sister.
She had your courage, your refusal to give up even when everything was hopeless.
What happened to her? She died defending Earth's last city while I was off playing soldier 3 sectors away.
By the time I got back, there was nothing left but craters and radiation.
Zara 7 was quiet for a moment. You blame yourself. I wasn't there when she needed me. Maybe if I had been, things would have been different. Or maybe you would have died with her, and accomplished nothing. Jake looked up from the neural probe, surprised by the matter-of-fact way she'd stated what his therapists and fellow soldiers had been trying to tell him for years. You think I'm wrong to feel guilty? I think guilt is a luxury you can't afford when there are still people who need saving. She held up her restrained hands. Like me. The simple statement cut through years of self-recrimination and doubt. Jake had spent so long looking backward that he'd forgotten how to see forward. But here was someone who needed him right now, in this moment, and maybe that was enough. All right, he said, picking up the neural probe. Let's save your life. The first procedure, breaking the genetic coding, required inserting molecular probes into Zara 7's bloodstream and locating the artificial markers that tied her DNA to her dead husband's biological signature. The process was delicate, requiring precise manipulation of genetic structures that were smaller than most people could imagine. Jake worked by touch as much as sight, guided by readouts that flickered and changed with each heartbeat. Zara 7 lay still on the examination table, her breathing controlled and steady despite the pain he knew she must be experiencing. Markers located, he announced after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. I can see the attachment points, but they're integrated deeper than I expected. This is going to require some creative molecular surgery. Do what you have to do. The next phase involved introducing engineered enzymes that would selectively target the artificial markers while leaving her natural DNA untouched. It was like performing surgery with a molecular scalpel while wearing blindfolds and oven mitts, requiring a combination of skill, luck, and desperation that made Jake's hands shake. Talk to me, he said, needing distraction from the magnitude of what he was attempting. Tell me about Altair Prime. What's it like? Beautiful, Zara 7 whispered, her voice growing weaker as the enzymes did their work. Cities that float among the clouds, connected by bridges made of crystallized light. The entire planet is a work of art, sculpted over thousands of years by people who believed beauty was the highest form of truth. Sounds paradise. It was. Until the Confederacy arrived and decided that beauty without power was just decoration. Jake monitored the enzyme progress, watching as artificial genetic markers dissolved one by one. Each success brought them closer to breaking the coding, but also closer to triggering defensive mechanisms that could kill her if he moved too fast. My father was the planetary governor, she continued, her words becoming more labored as the procedure progressed. He negotiated our surrender to avoid bloodshed. The Confederacy promised to honor our autonomy, protect our culture. Let me guess, they lied. Within a year, Altair Prime was strip-mined for resources and my people were relocated to labor camps. The beautiful cities were declared inefficient and demolished. My father died of shame, and my brothers were executed for seditious thoughts. But you survived. I was married off to a Confederate official as part of a cultural exchange program designed to show that Altarians could be successfully integrated into civilized society. Jake felt something cold and angry settle in his chest. Cultural exchange. Is that what they called it? Among other things. My husband was not a kind man. He enjoyed the control the coding gave him over me, the knowledge that I literally couldn't survive without his approval. What happened to him? Zara 7 was quiet for so long that Jake thought she'd lost consciousness. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I killed him. Jake's hands stilled on the controls. How? Poison. Something I synthesized from materials in his own laboratory. It took 3 months to develop something that would be undetectable, another 2 months to find an opportunity to use it. No regrets? Only that it took me so long to find the courage. Jake resumed his work, feeling a new respect for the woman on his table. Political bride, scientist, and now assassin Zara 7 was turning out to be far more complex than her circumstances suggested. Almost done with the first procedure, he announced, watching the last few genetic markers dissolve. The coding is breaking down nicely. How are you feeling? Like I'm dying, but in a good way. Jake couldn't help but smile. That's the enzymes doing their work.
Another few minutes and you'll be free of the genetic leash. The final marker dissolved with a flash of data across his screens, and, suddenly, Zara 7's vital signs stabilized in a pattern that looked almost normal. The coding was broken, she was no longer biologically bound to her dead husband.
Phase 1 complete, Jake announced.
You're officially a free woman, genetically speaking.
Zara 7 opened her eyes,
and, for the first time since he'd met her, Jake saw something other than fear and desperation.
She looked alive.
I can feel it, she whispered.
The weight is gone. The constant pressure in my head, the feeling that something was eating me from the inside out. It's gone. How long since you felt normal?
5 years.
Since the day I was married.
Jake began cleaning up from the first procedure, preparing for the more dangerous task of removing the neural restraints. Outside, he could hear the wind picking up, carrying the sound of distant engines. Maybe just traders passing through, maybe something more dangerous.
Either way, they were running out of time. Ready for round 2, he asked. Zara 7 sat up slowly, testing her range of motion. The restraints still limited her movements, but Jake could see that she felt different, stronger, more like herself.
Ready, she said, and, for the first time since he'd met her, her voice carried the full force of her personality rather than just a frightened whisper. Jake began preparing the equipment for restraint removal, but his hands paused as a new sound reached his ears. Not the distant rumble of traders, but the distinctive whine of Confederate military vehicles approaching fast.
We've got company, he said grimly.
Zara 7 looked toward the ceiling, as if she could see through rock and metal to the threats gathering above.
How long?
Maybe 10 minutes before they find the entrance to this place.
5 minutes after that before they break through the security doors. Can you remove the restraints in 15 minutes?
Jake looked at the complex devices around her wrists, thinking about everything that could go wrong with a rushed procedure.
I can try. But, if I make a mistake? Then, I'll die free instead of living as a slave. Outside, the sound of vehicles grew louder, accompanied now by the harsh voices of Zephyrian soldiers setting up a perimeter.
Jake realized that his problems were about to multiply exponentially, but, looking at Zara 7 really looking at her, seeing the determination in her violet eyes, he knew there was only one choice he could make.
All right, he said, picking up the neural interface tools. Let's see how good I really am. The neural restraints fought him every step of the way. Jake worked with surgical precision as the sounds of Zephyrian soldiers echoed through the ruins above.
Each probe insertion required perfect timing, too fast and, the restraints would interpret it as an escape attempt, sending crippling jolts through Zara 7's nervous system.
Too slow and, they'd run out of time before the security door gave way.
Neural Pathway 7, Zara 7 whispered, her voice tight with controlled pain. The interface is trying to reroute through my motor cortex.
If it succeeds,
you'll be paralyzed, Jake finished, his hands never pausing as he adjusted the probe's position.
I see it. Blocking the reroute now.
Above them, something heavy crashed against the saloon's main floor.
Voices shouted commands in the harsh Zephyrian dialect, followed by the distinctive whine of scanning equipment.
They were searching methodically, room by room, looking for any sign of their quarry.
Commander Vextar's voice, Zara 7 identified, her enhanced hearing picking up details Jake couldn't distinguish. He's brought a full hunting pack. 20 soldiers, maybe 25. Can you tell what equipment they're carrying?
Energy weapons, neural scramblers, and something that sounds like a deep scan resonator.
They're not just looking for us, they're mapping the entire structure. Jake cursed under his breath. Deep scan resonators could penetrate most forms of camouflage and shielding. Marcus Webb's hidden sanctuary would be revealed within minutes. How much longer? Zara 7 asked, watching his face in the thermal lantern's soft glow. 10 minutes for a safe removal. 5 if I'm willing to risk permanent nerve damage. 2 if I throw caution to the wind and pray.
Then, throw caution to the wind. Zara 7, if I make a mistake, my name is Zara Thelvaresh, daughter of Altair Prime's last free governor, doctor of bioengineering from the Crystal Universities, and the woman who killed Confederate General Thys Mordek in his own bed. Her violet eyes blazed with defiant fire. I did not survive 5 years of slavery and genetic bondage to die cowering in a basement. Remove these restraints so I can fight. Jake stared at her for a moment, processing the revelation that she'd assassinated not just any Confederate official, but General Mordek, the architect of the Altarian genocide and one of the most powerful military commanders in Zephyrian space. The woman lying on his examination table wasn't just a runaway bride. She was one of the most wanted fugitives in the galaxy. Mordek was your husband? My owner, she corrected. He collected intelligent women the way some people collect art. Had us modified to ensure we could never leave, never resist, never be anything but decoration for his ego. How many others? 7, when I arrived. I was the last to be added to his collection. Her voice grew cold as winter in space. Also the last to survive. You killed them all. I freed them all. Death was the only freedom Mordek's coding allowed. The weight of that confession settled between them like a live thing. Jake understood now why the Zephyrians had mobilized such a large force. Zara wasn't just valuable property, she was a symbol of resistance that they couldn't allow to exist. Above them, the deep scan resonator began its work, sending penetrating waves through the building's structure. The hidden door to their sanctuary wouldn't remain hidden much longer. We need to move, Jake said, making his decision. I'm going to attempt rapid extraction. If it works, you'll have full mobility within minutes. If it fails, then I'll die fighting instead of running. Do it. Jake activated the emergency protocols he'd hoped never to use. Instead of the careful, methodical removal of neural connections, he began severing them in rapid sequence, trusting to luck and desperate skill to prevent catastrophic feedback. The first restraint came loose with a shower of sparks and a scream that Zara managed to muffle against her hand. Jake caught her as convulsions racked her body, holding her steady while her nervous system readjusted to freedom. One down, he gasped, moving immediately to the second restraint. The scanning equipment above suddenly went quiet, followed by a moment of absolute silence that made Jake's blood run cold. When the noise resumed, it was the sound of heavy boots moving with purpose rather than searching. They've found us, Zara said through gritted teeth. Second restraint, coming off now. This one fought harder, sending feedback loops through Zara's motor nerves that made her entire left side spasm. But Jake had learned from the first removal, and he was ready for the device's defensive mechanisms. The restraint sparked and died, leaving angry red marks around her wrist. Both wrists are free, he announced. How do you feel? Zara sat up slowly, flexing her fingers with wonder. Like myself. For the first time in 5 years, I feel like myself. The sounds from above changed again, heavy equipment being moved into position, energy weapons powering up. Then, Vexstar's voice echoed through the building, amplified by some kind of speaker system. Jake Morrison. We know you're here. Surrender the property you stole, and your death will be quick. Jake helped Zara to her feet, noting with satisfaction that her movements were smooth and controlled despite the trauma of the restraint removal. Can you fight? Give me a weapon and find out. Jake moved to the weapon racks that lined the sanctuary's walls. Most were empty, but Marcus Webb had been thorough in his preparations. Hidden panels revealed emergency caches, energy weapons, projectile firearms, and enough ammunition to hold off an army. Human weapons, Jake explained, handing her a pulse rifle. Might not be as advanced as Confederate technology, but they're reliable and they hit hard. Zara examined the weapon with professional competence, checking the energy cell and testing the weight distribution. Magazine capacity? 40 shots, full power. Twice that if you dial down to stun. And you? Jake picked up his grandfather's old lever-action rifle, a weapon that had been old when Earth was young but still functioned perfectly after all these years. From his belt, he drew the plasma revolver he'd carried for 15 years of warfare and rebellion. Old school, he said with a grim smile. Sometimes the old ways work best. The first explosion shook dust from the ceiling as the Zephyrians began their assault on the sanctuary's entrance. Webb's security door was built to withstand siege conditions, but Jake knew it wouldn't hold forever. We need an exit strategy, Zara said, moving to examine the sanctuary's layout. Webb built this place with 3 escape routes. Problem is, all of them lead into the town's main streets. We'll be fighting in the open. How many routes back to your vehicle? 2, maybe 3 if we're creative. But they'll have the hover bike under surveillance by now. Zara was quiet for a moment, thinking with the tactical mind that had allowed her to assassinate one of the galaxy's most dangerous men. When she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. We don't run, she said. Running just delays the inevitable. They have superior numbers, better equipment, and unlimited reinforcements. Our only advantage is that they want me alive. What are you suggesting? We make them pay such a high price for taking this place that even Zephyrian Command starts questioning whether I'm worth the casualties. Jake studied her face, seeing not the terrified bride he'd rescued from the cosmic horseshoe, but the brilliant strategist who'd single-handedly crippled Confederate operations throughout 3 sectors. You have a plan. I have several. The question is whether you're willing to trust a woman you've known for less than a day. Another explosion, closer this time. The security door was beginning to buckle under the sustained assault. Lady, at this point I trust a malfunctioning navigation computer if it got us out of here alive. Zara's smile was sharp as a blade. Then, listen carefully. Webb's sanctuary has one advantage that even he probably didn't realize. She moved to the communication station, powering up systems that hadn't been used in years. The screens flickered to life, showing a complex network of connections that extended far beyond the sanctuary itself. This isn't just a safe room, she continued, her fingers dancing across the control interfaces with practiced skill. It's a command center. Webb connected it to the town's entire infrastructure, power grid, water systems, mining equipment, everything. And all of that infrastructure is still connected to the planetary network. Which means from this room, I can access every automated system on New Tombstone. Including the orbital defense platforms that the Confederacy deactivated but never actually dismantled. Jake felt his heart skip a beat. The platforms are still up there? According to these readings, 5 of them are still in stable orbit. Power systems offline, weapons dormant, but structurally intact. All they need is someone with the right codes to bring them back online. You can do that? I can do better than that. I can turn them into the galaxy's most expensive fireworks display. The final explosion blew the security door off its hinges, sending a shower of metal fragments into the sanctuary. Through the smoke and debris, Jake could see Zephyrian soldiers taking positions for their assault. Time's up, he said, raising his rifle. Whatever you're planning, do it fast. Zara's hands moved across the communications console with inhuman speed, accessing systems and bypassing security protocols with the skill of someone who'd spent years studying Confederate technology. Status lights began flickering to life across the control panel. Platform 1 responding, she announced. Bringing power systems online. The first Zephyrian soldier appeared in the doorway, energy weapon raised. Jake's rifle spoke once, and the soldier dropped with a hole through his chest armor. 2 more appeared immediately behind him. Platform 2 online. Beginning weapons charging sequence. Jake's plasma revolver barked twice, dropping both soldiers. But he could hear more coming, and the entrance was too narrow to hold them off indefinitely. Platform 3 responding. Orbital position optimized for surface bombardment. Zara, whatever you're doing, Platform 4 online. All weapons systems active and targeted. Commander Vexstar's voice boomed from the entrance, amplified by his armor's speakers. Surrender now, and the human dies quickly. Continue this resistance, and I will personally ensure that you spend the next decade dying slowly in our pleasure gardens. Zara looked up from the console, her violet eyes blazing with defiance. Tell him I have a counteroffer. Jake relayed the message, and Vexstar's laugh echoed through the sanctuary like breaking glass. The property wishes to negotiate? How amusing. Very well, speak. Platform 5 online. Full weapons grid active and ready for firing sequence.
Zara stood up from the console, moving to stand beside Jake with her pulse rifle in her hands.
Tell him this: I am Dr. Zara Thelvaresh, and I have just activated the orbital defense network that his people thought they'd neutralized. Tell him that I have enough firepower pointed at this planet to turn it into molten glass, and the only thing preventing me from pulling that trigger is his immediate and complete withdrawal.
Jake stared at her for a moment, then keyed his comm unit. Commander Vextar, you might want to look up. Through the broken entrance, Jake could see the Zephyrian soldiers checking their tactical displays. Shouts of alarm echoed through the ruins as orbital sensors confirmed what Zara had accomplished. Impossible, Vextar snarled. The platforms were deactivated.
Their weapon systems were dismantled.
Apparently not all of them, Jake replied. The lady seems to have found your people's oversight. She's bluffing. The platforms couldn't have enough power to. Zara leaned over Jake's shoulder, speaking directly into the comm unit. Commander, I'm transmitting targeting data for Platform 3.
You might want to evacuate the building directly north of your current position. 30 seconds later, a lance of coherent energy descended from orbit, turning a ruined storefront into a crater of molten stone and superheated glass. The demonstration had the desired effect. The sounds of Zephyrian movement suddenly became much more urgent and distinctly more distant.
Now that I have your attention, Zara continued, here are my terms. You and your soldiers withdraw immediately to minimum safe distance, let's say 50 kilometers.
You report to your superiors that the fugitive Zara Thelvaresh died in combat, along with the human terrorist Jake Morrison.
In exchange, I don't use these platforms to target every Confederate installation within 100 light-years.
You would not dare.
The retaliation would fall on a dead planet orbiting a destabilized star. I'm a bioengineering specialist, Commander.
I know exactly how to make this world uninhabitable for the next 1,000 years.
The comm channel went silent for nearly 5 minutes.
When Vextar finally responded, his voice carried the grudging respect of one predator acknowledging another.
Terms accepted, Dr. Thelvaresh. But understand that this only delays your capture.
The Confederacy's reach is long. Commander, the Confederacy's reach isn't half as long as the range of these orbital platforms.
I suggest you keep that in mind.
Jake listened to the sounds of Zephyrian forces withdrawing, hardly believing what had just happened.
Did we actually win? We bought time, Zara corrected, settling back at the communications console.
How much time depends on how long it takes them to figure out that the platforms only have enough power for maybe 12 more shots before their reactors go critical.
How long is that? If they're smart?
About 6 hours.
If they're overconfident? Maybe 12.
Jake holstered his weapons and moved to sit beside her.
So what do we do with our borrowed time? Zara's smile was enigmatic. We disappear. But first, we send a message that will echo across the galaxy.
She began working at the console again, but this time she was accessing communication networks rather than weapons systems. Her fingers flew across the controls with practiced ease, penetrating security systems and bypassing encryption protocols with the skill of someone who'd been planning this moment for years.
What kind of message? The kind that turns a dead bioengineering professor into a symbol of resistance, Zara replied.
The kind that tells every slave in Confederate space that their chains can be broken. Jake watched her work, beginning to understand that he'd stumbled into something much larger than a simple rescue mission.
Zara Thelvaresh wasn't just running from the past, she was building a future.
You've been planning this for a long time, he said. 5 years, 7 months, and 16 days.
Since the night Mordek first locked these restraints around my wrists.
She paused in her work, looking at him with those remarkable violet eyes.
I've been waiting for someone like you, Jake Morrison.
Someone who still believes that fighting impossible odds is better than accepting inevitable defeat.
And, if I hadn't come along? Then, I would have found another way. Or died trying.
Her smile was soft but determined. That's what freedom means, the right to choose your own ending. As Zara worked, Jake found himself thinking about Sarah, about all the battles he'd fought and lost, about the weight of carrying on when hope seemed dead.
Maybe Zara was right.
Maybe guilt was a luxury he couldn't afford when there were still people who needed saving. Outside, the sounds of Zephyrian withdrawal faded into the distance, leaving only the wind and the whisper of sand against stone. For the first time in years, Jake Morrison allowed himself to believe that tomorrow might be better than yesterday. "Ready?" Zara asked, her hand hovering over the transmission controls. "Ready for what?" "To change the galaxy." The transmission began as a whisper across the galaxy's communication networks. Zara's message piggybacked on Confederate military channels, civilian broadcasts, and commercial data streams, spreading like wildfire through the interconnected web of technology that bound thousands of worlds together. Within minutes, her words were being heard in slave camps, resistance hideouts, and the private chambers of planetary governors throughout known space. Jake watched the transmission counters climb on Zara's console, hundreds of recipients, then thousands, then millions. Each relay station that received her signal automatically forwarded it to a dozen others, creating an exponential cascade that even the Confederate sensors couldn't contain. "This is Dr. Zara Thelvaresh," her voice carried with crystal clarity across the void between stars. "Some of you know me as the bride of THYSS Mordek, the woman who was supposed to symbolize Altarian submission to Confederate rule. Today, I speak to you as something else entirely, as a free woman who has broken her chains and stands ready to help you break yours." The first part of the message was personal, telling the story of her capture, her years of slavery, and the genetic coding that had kept her bound to a man who viewed her as property. But, as she spoke, her narrative expanded to encompass the broader tragedy of Confederate occupation, the systematic destruction of cultures, the reduction of entire species to slave labor, the transformation of a diverse galaxy into a sterile empire built on suffering. "They told us that resistance was futile," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "They told us that we were inferior, that our only value lay in serving our betters. They lied." Jake found himself mesmerized by the transformation taking place before him. The frightened woman he'd rescued from the cosmic horseshoe was gone, replaced by someone who radiated authority and unshakable conviction. This was the voice that had convinced hardened revolutionaries to trust her, the intellect that had outmaneuvered Confederate security for 5 years, the spirit that had turned assassination into art form. "The proof of their lies stands before you now," Zara declared. "I am one woman, armed only with knowledge and determination, and I have just forced an entire Confederate military force to withdraw from their own objective. If one person can accomplish this, imagine what we could do together." The second part of the transmission was more technical, containing detailed schematics for neutralizing neural restraints, breaking genetic coding, and disrupting the control mechanisms that kept billions in bondage. Zara had spent years studying Confederate biotechnology, and she was now sharing that knowledge with anyone brave enough to use it. "These techniques have been tested," she explained, walking viewers through complex procedures with the patience of a teacher and the precision of a surgeon. "I used them to free myself and 6 other women from Mordek's collection. With proper preparation and adequate medical support, they can work for anyone." Jake noticed that she didn't mention the fate of the other women, that they'd chosen death over continued slavery. Some truths were too heavy to broadcast across an entire galaxy. The third part of the transmission was the most dangerous, a detailed breakdown of Confederate military structure, revealing weaknesses and vulnerabilities that Zara had observed during her years at the highest levels of their society. Command protocols, communication frequencies, security procedures, everything a resistance movement would need to strike effectively at their oppressors. "Their strength lies in our isolation," she explained, displaying tactical analyses that would have been worth fortunes to rebel commanders throughout the galaxy. "They convince us that we're alone, that our suffering is unique, that no one else would understand our pain. But we are not alone. From the mining colonies of the Outer Rim to the pleasure palaces of the core worlds, we share the same chains. And chains that bind many can be broken by many." As the transmission neared its end, Jake realized that Zara had just committed the ultimate act of rebellion. She'd transformed herself from a fugitive hiding in the shadows into a beacon that every oppressed soul in the galaxy could see. The Confederacy would hunt her with every resource at their disposal, but they'd never be able to silence the message she'd just sent. "This is not a call for suicide," she concluded, her voice carrying across light years to reach desperate people in desperate places. "This is a call for hope. Hope that freedom is possible. Hope that we can build something better than what we've been given. Hope that our children will inherit a galaxy where their worth is not measured by their usefulness to others.
Jake watched the transmission counters continue to climb. 12 million recipients. 15 million. 20 million and, still growing.
Within hours, virtually every inhabited world in known space would have received Zara's message. The orbital platforms will not hold Confederate forces forever, she admitted, acknowledging the reality of their situation. But they will hold long enough for this message to spread, long enough for people to prepare, long enough for the galaxy to know that the fight is not over. She paused then, and Jake could see her gathering herself for the final words that would define her legacy. My name is Dr. Zara Thelvaresh of Altair Prime, and I am no longer property. To those who would claim ownership over thinking beings, I say this: we are not your resources to be exploited, not your decorations to be displayed, not your tools to be used and discarded. We are free beings with free minds, and we will not yield our dignity to your convenience. To my fellow victims of Confederate oppression, I say this: you are not alone.
You are not forgotten. And you are not powerless.
The same fire that burns in my heart burns in yours.
The same intelligence that allowed me to escape my chains lives in your minds. The same courage that brought me to this moment flows in your veins. We are more than they know. We are stronger than they believe. And we are coming.
Zara ended the transmission with the upload of a massive data package, everything she'd learned about Confederate technology, biology, and military operations during her years of captivity. It was a complete intelligence briefing that would take rebel analysts months to fully process, and it was now freely available to anyone with the courage to use it. The console fell silent, leaving only the soft hum of cooling electronics and the distant sound of wine through the ruins above. Jake stared at the transmission logs, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd just witnessed.
27 million confirmed recipients, he said finally. Still climbing. It's enough, Zara replied, powering down the communications array. The message will spread faster than they can contain it now.
By tomorrow, every Confederate slave in the galaxy will know that escape is possible.
And every Confederate hunter will be looking for us. Yes.
She turned to face him, and Jake saw that the fierce determination in her eyes was tempered by something else: peace, perhaps, or the satisfaction of a job completed.
The question is, what do we do now?
Jake thought about that question, weighing their limited options against the enormity of what they'd just accomplished.
They could run, try to disappear into the vast emptiness between the stars.
They could fight, make their last stand here among the ruins of human dreams.
Or they could do something else entirely.
We could go back to the cosmic horseshoe, he suggested.
Molly would hide us, at least for a while. And accomplish what? Hide until they track us down? Maybe. Or maybe we use the time to plan something bigger. Zara was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the soft glow of the thermal lantern. Bigger how? You just sent a message to 27 million people. Some of them are going to answer. Some of them are going to want to fight.
They're going to need leadership, coordination, someone who understands both the enemy and the technology.
You're talking about rebuilding the resistance. I'm talking about building something the galaxy's never seen before.
Not just human resistance, not just Altarian rebels, but every oppressed species working together.
A real alliance.
It would take years to organize something like that.
Decades, maybe.
Then, we'd better get started.
Zara stood up from the console, moving to the weapon rack where she'd left her pulse rifle.
For a moment, Jake thought she might be preparing for a final battle. Instead, she began checking and cleaning the weapon with professional competence. There's something I haven't told you about the orbital platforms, she said without looking up from her work.
What? They're not going to run out of power in 12 hours. They're going to run out of power in 12 minutes.
Jake felt his heart stop.
What?
The reactors were more damaged than I initially calculated. I've been running them far beyond safe parameters just to maintain the threat.
They'll start going critical any moment now. And you didn't think to mention this earlier? Because it doesn't change anything. We were always going to have to run eventually.
The only question was whether we'd run as fugitives or as symbols. As if summoned by her words, alarms began sounding from the communications console. The orbital platforms were beginning their final power cycles, their ancient reactors pushed beyond endurance by Zara's desperate gambit.
How long until the Zephyrians figure out what's happening?
Jake asked, grabbing his own weapons.
They probably already have. Vexstar's not stupid, just overconfident.
He'll have been monitoring the platform's energy signatures.
So we fight. So we run.
But, first. Zara moved back to the console, her fingers dancing over controls one final time. I'm going to give the galaxy one more present.
What are you doing? Programming the platform's final act. When their reactors go critical, they're going to take out every Confederate orbital installation within 100 light-years.
Supply depots, communication relays, military stations, all of it.
Jake stared at her in amazement. You're turning them into weapons. I'm turning them into the galaxy's largest fireworks display.
One that will be visible from thousands of worlds, reminding everyone who saw my transmission that we meant what we said. The first platform's death scream was visible through the sanctuary's ventilation shafts, a brilliant flash of light that painted the ruins in stark relief. Four more followed in rapid succession, each explosion marking the destruction of Confederate infrastructure that had taken decades to build.
That's our cue to leave, Zara said, shouldering her rifle.
They made their way through the sanctuary's escape tunnels, emerging into the ruins of Haven just as Zephyrian forces began their second assault. But, this time, they weren't heading for the sanctuary, they were evacuating as fast as their vehicles could carry them, fleeing the debris field that was raining down from orbit. Jake's hover bike was exactly where he'd left it, somehow overlooked in the chaos. They climbed aboard and raced through the ruins, leaving Haven behind as Confederate forces regrouped in the distance.
Where to? Jake shouted over the engine noise.
Anywhere but here, Zara replied.
We've got a galaxy to liberate.
As they rode through the badlands of New Tombstone, Jake found himself thinking about the future for the first time in years. Not the grim, grinding struggle for survival that had defined his existence since Earth's fall, but actual possibility. Somewhere out there, 27 million people were reading Zara's message, learning that resistance was possible, discovering that they weren't alone.
You know what we've done, don't you? He called back to her.
What?
We've just started a war that will reshape the galaxy.
Good, she replied, her arms tightening around his waist as they raced toward an uncertain dawn.
It's about time.
Behind them, the ruins of Haven glowed with the light of fallen stars, and, above them, the debris of Confederate infrastructure painted brief streaks across the night sky. It was beautiful and terrible and completely irreversible, the visible proof that the galaxy's longest night was finally ending. In the distance, Jake could see the lights of the cosmic horseshoe, where Molly O'Reilly would be waiting with questions they couldn't answer and whiskey they couldn't afford to refuse. Beyond that lay the vast emptiness of space, filled with worlds where people were reading Zara's message and beginning to believe that freedom might be possible. It was, Jake reflected, the most beautiful sight he'd ever seen. 6 months later, Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of the Starship Liberation's call, watching the blue marble of New Terra turn slowly beneath the ship's hull. The world had been a Confederate prison colony until 3 weeks ago, when a coordinated uprising of human and alien prisoners had overwhelmed their guards and declared independence. It was the 47th world to join what the Confederate propaganda machine now called the Terrorist Alliance, but which history would remember as the Free Worlds Coalition. The delegation from the Centauri Collective has arrived, Zara announced from behind him, her voice carrying the authority that had made her the coalition's de facto leader.
They're requesting immediate medical assistance for their newly liberated populations.
Jake turned to look at her, still amazed by the transformation that 6 months of freedom had wrought. The frightened bride he'd rescued from the cosmic horseshoe was gone, replaced by a leader who commanded the respect of rebels and revolutionaries from a dozen different species. She wore the simple uniform of the Coalition Medical Corps, but the neural interface circlet around her temples marked her as something more, the living symbol of resistance that her galaxy-wide broadcast had created.
How bad are the medical situations? Jake asked.
Worse than we expected. The Confederacy wasn't just using neural restraints, they were experimenting with biological control mechanisms. Genetic locks that prevent reproduction, enzyme inhibitors that cause gradual organ failure, neurological modifications that make independent thought physically painful.
Zara's expression darkened. We're not just fighting a war of liberation. We're fighting a war of biological rehabilitation. How many worlds can we actually help? With our current resources?
Maybe 12, if we push our medical ships to their limits.
We need more doctors, more equipment, more everything.
Jake nodded, understanding the crushing weight of responsibility that came with leading a galaxy-wide revolution. Every day brought news of successful uprisings, but also reports of failed rebellions and Confederate retaliation.
For every world they liberated, 2 more fell under increased oppression as the enemy tightened their control over remaining territories. What about the situation on Korath Prime? Still holding, but barely.
The local resistance managed to take control of the planetary capital, but Confederate forces are massing for a counterattack. They're requesting military advisors.
Send Marcus Webb's old unit.
If anyone can teach them how to hold a city against overwhelming odds, it's the Haven veterans.
Zara made a note on her portable datapad, one of hundreds of decisions she would make before the day ended.
The coalition operated on a shoestring budget with volunteers and salvaged equipment, but somehow they continued to grow stronger while the Confederate military grew more desperate.
There's something else, she said, her tone shifting to something more personal.
Intelligence reports from the core worlds suggest that the Confederacy is developing new weapons specifically designed to target coalition leadership.
What kind of weapons?
Biological. Engineered plagues that target specific genetic markers. If they can identify our key personnel and create pathogens designed to kill us specifically. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental systems.
They're talking about assassinating the leadership. They're talking about making it impossible for anyone to replace us. Kill the current leaders and ensure that anyone with similar genetic patterns dies shortly afterward. It's genocide disguised as warfare. How close are they to deploying something like that? Unknown. But our intelligence network suggests they're accelerating their timeline.
Probably because our victories are starting to threaten core Confederate worlds. Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking about the mathematics of revolution. They'd come farther than anyone had dared hope, but they were still outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting an enemy with seemingly unlimited resources.
The biological weapons program was exactly the kind of escalation he'd been dreading.
There might be a way to stop them, Zara said carefully.
But it would require taking enormous risks. What kind of risks?
The kind that could end the war immediately, or get us all killed trying. Before Jake could respond, the ship's communication system activated with the priority tone that meant urgent news from the front lines. Captain Sarah Chan's voice filled the observation deck, carrying the tension of someone delivering bad news. All senior staff to the command center immediately.
We've received a priority transmission from the Earth Reclamation Fleet.
Jake and Zara exchanged glances. The Earth Reclamation Fleet was the Coalition's most ambitious operation, an attempt to liberate humanity's birthworld from the radioactive wasteland the Confederacy had left behind. The mission was mostly symbolic, since Earth couldn't support life anymore, but symbols mattered in a war fought as much in the realm of ideas as in physical space. The command center was bustling with activity when they arrived. Holographic displays showed tactical situations from across the galaxy, while communication officers maintained contact with resistance cells on hundreds of worlds. At the center of it all stood Admiral Rosa Martinez, the former Confederate officer who'd defected after witnessing one too many atrocities against civilian populations.
Report, Zara commanded, taking her position at the main tactical display.
The Earth Reclamation Fleet has achieved their primary objective, Admiral Martinez announced. They've successfully deployed atmospheric processors on 3 continents and begun the terraforming process.
Initial estimates suggest the planet could support limited human habitation within 50 years.
A cheer went up from the assembled staff officers.
Earth's restoration had been considered impossible by most experts, but the Coalition's scientists had achieved what Confederate authorities claimed couldn't be done.
That's the good news, Martinez continued, her expression sobering.
The bad news is that Confederate High Command has declared the Earth operation an act of terrorism against a protected archaeological site.
They're mobilizing the entire Third Fleet to retake the system.
The celebration died instantly.
The Third Fleet was the Confederacy's most powerful naval force, commanded by Admiral Kreshtar, Bextar's cousin and the architect of the Eltarian genocide. If they were deploying the Third Fleet, it meant the Confederacy was finally taking the coalition seriously as a threat.
Fleet strength?
Jake asked.
800 ships, including 12 dreadnoughts and the flagship Inevitable Victory.
Full complement of ground forces, orbital bombardment capability, and enough firepower to glass every planet in the system.
And our forces?
The Earth Reclamation Fleet has 47 ships, mostly converted civilian vessels with minimal weapons. They're good enough to chase off pirate raiders, but against the Third Fleet.
Martinez shook her head.
They'll be slaughtered, Zara finished.
Unless we reinforce them.
We could pull ships from other sectors, maybe put together a force of 150 vessels.
Which would still be outnumbered 5-1 by superior ships with better weapons.
Jake studied the tactical display, thinking about the impossible mathematics of the situation. They couldn't win a conventional battle against the Third Fleet, but they couldn't abandon Earth either.
The planet's liberation was too important symbolically. If they lost it now, the damage to coalition morale could be catastrophic. What about unconventional warfare? He asked.
Such as?
The same kind of tactics that got us this far.
Hit and run, sabotage, turning their strengths against them. Admiral Martinez pulled up the strategic analysis of the Third Fleet's composition. Their biggest advantage is also their biggest weakness. They're deploying everything in one massive force, which means they're vulnerable to coordinated attacks on their support infrastructure.
Explain.
The Third Fleet requires massive logistical support, fuel ships, ammunition carriers.